Oh, I need my. Welcome you all to Hope Church Adult Ed. Have a seat. Adult Ed Committee has had so much fun planning this year's series. Jane Schuyler is our chair. We're already beginning to think about what we're doing next year. So if you have ideas of topics or of people you'd like to see explored, don't be bashful about passing on your ideas to Jane Schuyler. Today is kind of a special time for us because we're welcoming home Jennifer Van Hook. Jenny is a child of Hope Church. She's the daughter of our former pastor of 12 years, Marlon Vander Wilt, who is much beloved. She moved here as a 3-year-old and spent much of her growing up, he's here. She went to Longfellow Elementary, to what was then Holland Junior High. Then at age, I think, 15, their family moved to Orange City, where Marlon became pastor. And she graduated from Orange City High, and then went on to Carleton College, took her master's at the University of Wisconsin. And along the way, she became acquainted with a Christian school graduate in Orange City, and they had a bicultural marriage, sort of like a Holland Christian, Holland Public School marriage, and went together to the University of Texas, where Steve Van Hook, her husband, did a PhD in physics. He's now on the faculty of Penn State, much as Jennifer is directing the Population Research Center there. From there, they've moved to Bowling Green until finally ending up at Penn State University, where she is now. And she has become a national expert on the population of unauthorized immigrants. If you want to know how many there are and how that estimate is derived, well, this morning is your chance to get that question answered, along with many other such questions. Who are the immigrants who come to the U.S.? Here's the data from Homeland Security, how we estimate the unauthorized population number. And most recently, her book, published last fall, will be the subject of some of her remarks this morning. One Columbia University reviewer said, "Do not underestimate Mexican immigrants," argued Jennifer Van Hook and her co-author, who offer a sweeping account of the 37 million Americans of Mexican origin in the United States. I've mentioned that she's the daughter of Marlon Vander Wilt, but she's also the daughter of Judy Vander Wilt. And I like to think that Jenny is an apple that has landed not too far from her maternal tree. Judy was a professor in Orange City, and now Jenny is a professor. Judy has a crazy, almost masochistic love of doing 1,000-piece puzzles, which is a love that she shares with Jenny. Judy is on our Adult Ed Committee. Jenny just completed a term as chair of the Adult Ed Committee at their Presbyterian Church in State College, Pennsylvania. It's sometimes said that prophets are without honor in their home country. I'd like to think that this is a case where a prophet has come home and is being honored in her home place. She's here from Pennsylvania to speak to us this morning because of our interest in immigration. And Judy on our Adult Ed Committee noted that she did know somebody who had some expertise in this area. And also to celebrate her mother's birthday, which was this week. And so please join me in welcoming home Jenny Van Hook.
Okay. Oh. Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've entitled this talk today, Things That Divide Us. And I think it will become clearer as I walk through this, kind of what I'm talking about here. Because this is started as an academic talk, but I have adjusted it for adult ed. So I'm going to start with some familiar Bible verses. Okay, so I've got two in mind. One is this one from the Old Testament, and this appears in Leviticus, but also Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, throughout. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And I think what this is calling us, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? It's calling us to think about this foreigner as one of us, but it's also calling us to empathy through remembering the situation that we were once in the past, and then drawing a connection with outsiders to insiders through those shared experiences. Another one that I want to emphasize is this verse in the New Testament where Paul says, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, and there's no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And in this verse, I feel like this is a verse about inequality, because Paul is talking here about all of the ways in which, in the Roman world, there were large divisions, and it's more than just divisions, they're hierarchies. These are the ways that the society was ordered at that time. And he's calling us to Christ. And in Christ, we would be a leveler. Christ would be the leveler. So how do we do this? And what are the things that get in the way of us remembering? And what are the things that get us in the way of having and achieving that sort of leveling of these differences? So as a sociologist, I think about this all the time. And we think about, in sociology, we use this language of boundaries. What are the boundaries that circumscribe the groups from one another? And what are the nature of those boundaries? Are they bright boundaries or are they blurry boundaries? So the bright boundaries would be boundaries like we might see between racial groups that persist in terms of the inequalities that we see. Blurry boundaries might be ethnic boundaries that have softened over time and across generations, so that we can put them on, we can be Dutch or German or Italian at the holidays, when we have our special foods, when we enjoy sort of that ethnic uniqueness about who we are as a people, but then we can put those things away when we don't need them or when they're not convenient, and people don't see that on us. And so we can go in and out of those boundaries. We can marry across those boundaries, whatever we've created. Those are the blurry boundaries. And so in this book, we're really talking about what makes bright boundaries, what makes blurry boundaries. Okay? And we really focus on Mexican Americans as an example to really explore these issues. Are Mexicans and Mexican Americans an ethnic group that has blurry boundaries that will eventually become one with us as a society? Or are they a racialized minority group where we have these bright boundaries and these more or less permanent inequalities that are just likely to persist across generations? And the short answer, so if you read the book, is that it depends on where you look and when you look. Because there's been a great deal of differences across space and over time in terms of the degree to which we set up exclusionary contexts that exclude people or include people. So we start with this idea about there's a lot of evidence that the boundaries between Mexican Americans and US-born whites is very sharp. And this kind of graph that shows, this is the level of education. So if you look at the share with more than a high school degree here, and we break it down by generational status, what we see is in the first generation, that's in red, you have very, very low levels of educational attainment. By the second generation, there's a huge increase because those children born here were welcomed into American school systems, more or less, and you see a huge increase over time. But then in the third generation, there's something called stall, okay? There's no improvement between the second and the third generation. And this was an opinion piece written by Ross Dothert in the New York Times. And he kind of points to this evidence and says, you know, it's pretty easy to see how third generation stall could continue into the future. And he kind of lists all the different ways we keep these groups separate and unequal over time. So by comparison, there's non-Hispanic whites being quite a bit different. So, okay. So we're kind of coming to this and thinking, okay, who's in that third generation? These are the grandchildren of the Mexicans who arrived during the industrial era. So that's why I'm going to take a step back in time and look at the origins of these different groups. What I'm showing you here is immigrant admissions to the United States since records were kept about this. So these are all the newcomers, right? In blue, they're European. The red are Latin American, predominantly from Mexico, but now increasingly from other countries. So if we focus in on the industrial era, I look around this room, most of the people in this room probably descended from people who arrived during that time period. This is the steamship era where there's all these steamships coming from Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Europe, to the United States, and it's this giant wave of immigration, okay? But you see the little red tip there, along there? There was like this ongoing Mexican migration from the South as well into the United States during this time. And those people formed sort of the basis or the grandparents and the great-grandparents of today's third or higher generation. So that's the group I really want to focus on. And what we argue is that during that time period, this was like a pre-civil rights time period, and there were exclusionary contexts for reception of immigrants, and there were in more or less inclusionary contexts. And the exclusionary context more or less centered around sort of these Jim Crow-like labor controls that were occurring in the American South at the time, whereas there was more or less a progressive movement that was more welcoming of immigrants in the Northeast and the Midwest. And this made a big difference in terms of where you landed, where you settled. In the post-civil rights era, it was less demarcated by geography, and it's more currently demarcated by immigration status, whether you're legal or you have a legal status or not. So I'm going to get to that in a sec. So just really quickly, I want to show you this chart. What this depicts is the progression of immigrants across generations. And so like among fourth and third generation immigrants today, they have their origins, like their grandparents and great-grandparents were born earlier in the century. And then you can kind of you can follow them over time as they progress across generations. And what we're arguing here is that the third and fourth generation, the group that didn't have such great outcomes, some of that has to do with the situations that their grandparents and parents were in that were then passed along. Because if you don't have a lot of money, it's really hard to send your kids to college, right? And so these disadvantages trickle down across generations, and that's why we're still seeing them today. So, okay, real quick, I use linked census data to do this work. You can read the book if you want to hear more about the methods. We also digitized a lot of school data. So we went back in time to like 1918 to 1956, and we digitized all of these school records so we could see the amount of investment in public schools was going on in all of these school districts across the country. So we could see, for example, that Grand Rapids Public Schools was one of the most highly invested school districts in the country. It probably had the highest rates of funding. Can you believe that? Whereas in Texas, it was one of the lowest. And so, what was that? Yeah. And then we also look at historical accounts. We use the census data to link together families. So we can put together 3 generations of families that we can follow over time. And so the census data is not linked initially, but we did it in the special restricted data lab so that we could kind of create these families. And then we could look at the educational attainment of the grandparents, the parents, and then the children. We look at these groups. We focus mostly on education because education is sort of a linchpin, right, to all kinds of other opportunities that people get in American society especially. It's really helpful for income, for occupation, for access to health care. People with more education live longer. It's the key to a lot of other kinds of success. Here's my team. We got funding from the Russell Sage Foundation, so this was really helpful for doing this work. Okay. We always have to give these disclosures because we do all of this research in a lab, and then we have to submit it to the government to approve. They don't approve it for the contents. They approve it for to make sure that we're not disclosing any information about individuals. And so all of this is approved from the Census Bureau. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this quote here. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt, empathy through remembrance. And one thing that I was reflecting on is that what makes it hard to remember? And we all kind of remember, right? We remember our family stories, but do we remember with accuracy? You know? And so I want to focus on this thing called the success narrative. How many of you have success narratives in your family histories? Yeah, so what are they? They kind of start with like, oh, my great-grandparents, when they first got here, they were so poor that, fill in the blank, right? And then they worked like crazy. They worked 20 hours a day. They walked to school uphill both ways, in the snow, and they made it, right? And so these are wonderful stories, right? And they tend to be recalled over and over and over again. Here's there's an underside to this, okay? So this is a general social survey question in 1994. And it says, the Irish, Italians, Jews, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Today's immigrants should do the same without special favors. Okay, so, and then they asked, do you agree or disagree? 80% agreed or strongly agreed to that statement. So what does that mean, right? It means that we're taking our success narrative that we believe that we were successful, and we were, right? But we attribute that success to all of our own efforts. And therefore, we don't have much empathy for the needs of the next wave of immigrants. So just to kind of reiterate the success story again, we see it in our numbers, okay? So what I'm showing you here is the average educational attainment relative to US-born white people at the time, okay? So anything below the line means a deficit in education. Anything above the line is a advantage in education. And what I'm showing you is the trajectory across generations, first, second, third generation.
Is the zero high school?
No, the zero is US-born whites. So like in the beginning here, the first generation.
What is the zero for? What's the
So
zero?
like non-Hispanic Europeans
Yes.
from in their first.
Zero high school.
No, the zero is the level of education for US-born white people in 1940.
Baseline, whatever that might be.
Yeah, whatever that is, because that changes over time. So in 1940, US-born European immigrants had less education, but by just a little bit, right? And then by 2000 or later, by the third generation, they have just a little bit more education than US-born whites. Here's the Irish. There's Eastern Europeans, there's Central Europeans, and here's Southern Europeans. So Southern Europeans, I love this story. These are mostly Italians. They start out with a huge disadvantage in educational attainment. All of them, by the third generation, are doing better than the average, like fourth or fifth or sixth generation white person. Does that make sense? So this industrial wave of immigration, one way of putting it is this big industrial wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe ended up making our country more educationally like advantaged than if they hadn't come. Does that make sense? So we look at this and it's like, oh, what happened? How did this happen? What is this immigrant success story? What is the reason for it?
Is the black line essentially Jewish?
Yes, yes. Eastern Europeans were mostly Jewish. Yeah. So I love this story, Mom. So we were visiting one summer a couple years ago, and we started telling the story about Grandpa, okay, my mom's dad. And here's a picture of him here. Here's my grandmother, my grandfather, and then this is Judy. And they have a wonderful success story, okay? Grandpa grew up in a household, it was basically a single mother household. His mother only spoke Dutch, very poor. Grandpa had to work in high school, you know, to kind of keep everything afloat. And he finished high school. So he was kind of like those Italians, right? And he finished high school, he went on to work for American Seating. He eventually became a vice president. He put all four of his kids through college, and they all took, you know, became, I don't know, professors and doctors and so forth. So this is a great success story. And a lot of the explanations for immigrant success, sociologically, have to do with, okay, what are the dynamics in immigrant families that seem to pressure kids in those situations to do better than the average? You know, and some of this has to do with the particular groups of people who chose to migrate. They were different than people who just stayed home. Maybe they were more ambitious, you know. There was also this thing about pressure to succeed because your parents sacrificed so much to come to this country. The best you know, the most you could do is, the least you could do is study, you know, and do well in school. Make your parents proud, you know. And certainly that's a dynamic. Some people think about it as a new start. There's a couple of economists who make this argument. But I haven't seen a whole lot of people talk about where it is that you started from, you know, where it is that you landed. And this is where I really want to talk about this progressive movement that occurred in the 1920s and 1930s in the Northeast and the Midwest. There's a side to this that maybe we wouldn't find very attractive. It was referred to as the Americanization movement, and it was very ethnocentric. Okay, it really thought that American culture was superior to any of those ethnic cultures, whether it be German or Italian or Jewish or what, you know. They really wanted everybody to kind of throw off their ethnicity and become American, you know. But part of this, if you look in the back of this picture, this is an old picture, school, citizenship, homes. The Americanization movement wanted you to forget about your ethnicity, but they also wanted to equip you with the resources you needed to be successful in American society. And so they had they had all these things that they put in place. They had these, what they called Americanization classes, but this was in the form of night schools. And they were often English language schools. They were also schools that helped you get occupational training so that you could get a job in, you know, whatever trade you might have known, or maybe you need a new trade. They also passed a bunch of English-only laws. Those turned out not to be very successful. But there were also schooling laws, okay? And those turned out to be extremely successful. Because what they did was they forced kids to go to school instead of work. And so there were a lot of families, they were pretty poor. They didn't really like these schooling laws, the compulsory schooling laws, but they had to send their kids to school. So here's the expenditure in public schooling across the United States. And you can see it's especially dark, or there's a lot of it, in the Northeast. There's also quite a lot in California. So I looked it up where my grandpa went to school. And, they're funding schools in Grand Rapids at a rate that's twice the level of the national average. Okay, so then he could go and get training to become a drafter, in the company where he ended up working. Here's the and it wasn't just the government and schools, but it was companies, okay? So the businesses in the areas participated in this movement. And so I got an invitation to go to the American Seating Company in Grand Rapids. And I said, well, what happened there? And he said, the man who I talked to said, you can come and look through our archives. So I spent an afternoon there and I took a bunch of pictures. And there's this old magazine called The Cedar. And, and they published it every month. And so I went through issue after issue. And in the 1920s and early 1930s, there's so much in these magazines about what they're doing for their workers. Okay, and 30% of their workers are immigrants, and maybe another 20% are children of immigrants. So probably half their workforce is foreign. They saw themselves as a modernizing force in American society because people were building schools at this time, and they were making school furniture. So that was part of their identity. But they also, in the Cedar, put all of these little articles trying to encourage their workers to become educated. So they go to the night school, Let's help the new man on the job. We were once new and on the job ourselves. That kind of sounds like Leviticus, doesn't it? They encouraged their workers to get become naturalized citizens. And so they would post, all these men just got their citizenship papers. Look at this, we should celebrate. They had a loan program so that their employees could buy homes. So this is one company, okay? And then they were in competition with other companies. Such and such a company, we have more citizens than that company. And they would put these little notices how they were doing better than the other, but they're all working on the same thing, right? Churches were part of this too. So I did a little research on the Presbyterian Church because that's where we go. And they had a whole program to address the needs of the immigrant communities at the time. So they would send pastors overseas to learn the language and learn the culture of the immigrant community back in Czechoslovakia or Italy or Sicily, wherever it was. And then they would set up churches in the immigrant communities here in the United States. And so here's an example of looks like a vacation Bible school program in Philadelphia where they did this. And these programs did everything, It wasn't just ministering religious needs. It was food programs, education programs, language programs. It was the whole gamut of. Here, after I gave this talk at my church, a woman, Connie Denuzio, came up to me and said, my husband grew up in this Presbyterian church, Italian Presbyterian church in Bristol, Pennsylvania. And she sent me this picture. And she goes, yeah, that's why we're Presbyterians today. Because they were originally Catholic. So, okay. So Next topic. So I guess the point here is we have to remember, but we have to remember accurately what our past was and what kind of support that our families got. The next thing I want to talk about is this idea about a leveler, being a leveler. One thing that makes it hard to level the playing field is Americans' obsession for the demand for cheap labor. And I would just say that very bluntly. It's something that I think in America, maybe other countries too, have struggled with over time. And the answers that we come up with in terms of how we organize labor have sometimes been more exploitative than other times. So slavery is an example of the demand for, there's this demand for cheap labor. What are we going to do? We're going to, bring over Africans and enslave them, In the case of Mexican Americans, there's a similar kind of story that happened in Texas especially. So I'm just going to show you first the educational attainment trajectories for Mexican Americans compared to Italians. So here's the line for Italian Americans, and this is what I showed you earlier, where they started out very disadvantaged, but then became sort of an advantaged group over time. Here are African Americans. So you can see they didn't ever catch up completely. Here's Mexican Americans. Okay? They started out maybe a little bit more disadvantaged than Italians, but not much. And the gap between the Italians and the Mexicans just grew over time because they were getting better in terms of getting more access to education across generations, but the gaps between them and the other groups never really closed, and in fact remained pretty large. So what happened? So Italians lived in mostly New York, right? But Mexican Americans lived mostly in Texas and California. And there were big differences, especially those who ended up in Texas. That made a difference for them. We rely very heavily on this book, this work of David Montejano. This is a wonderful history of Texas. And he really gets into sort of what was going on in early 20th century Texas. And he describes one of the things that's really telling is this how they organized agricultural production in Texas. There was sort of a plantation-like system where they had very, very large ranches. And especially like Dole was a company that landed in Texas near Galveston, and he talks about some of these other ranches where they're producing meat. And they needed workers, and Mexicans were the workers in this situation in this part of the country. And in fact, they would go to Mexico and recruit workers to come work on their ranches. Now that's fine, right? People need jobs, people need opportunities, but they wanted to organize the worker, and they devised a series of labor controls that were similar as much as possible to kind of reproduce the system that they had under slavery. And so they would trick people to stay on their ranches. They would hire people who didn't have cars, so they couldn't go away. They would fix the wages, so they would all get together, all the ranches would get together and say, this is what the wage is this year, so they wouldn't compete against one another. There's a lot of stories in this book about these labor controls. And this extended to education because they knew if they had an educated workforce, this would be the end of their source of cheap labor. And so here's a quote from a Texas school administrator back in the 30s, and this comes from Montejano's book. The farmers are not interested in educating Mexicans. They know that they can get better wages and conditions then. And here's a Texas superintendent Now, compulsory education started in Texas in 1915. So this is many years later. But it really didn't apply to Mexicans. So Texas, here's a superintendent. If I tried to enforce the compulsory attendance law here, the board would get sore at me, maybe cause me to lose my job. So he's not going to do it. And these kids were segregated, right? So they lived in Mexican towns, and maybe the school in that town would go up to 6th grade, but if they needed to go to middle school or high school, they would have to go to the white school next over, right? And that cost money, that was effort. So it was structured in a way that made it really hard. So when we look at the educational attainment across states, you can see what happened. So Texas, what this is the deficit in educational attainment for those second-generation kids. So these are all kids who were born in the United States. The green triangle are the Italians in the same state. The red dot are the Mexican kids in that state. The line is the US-born whites, again. Okay, so you can see when it's below the line, they're disadvantaged. Texas was by far the worst in terms of like reducing opportunity for Mexican kids. When you get to the Midwest, you start to see some parity happening. You start to see these kids just sort of being treated just like all of the other ethnic kids. And so there was a huge difference, and we could see this in the third generation then later. So a lot of what we're seeing today is a vestige of these kinds of practices in places like Texas 3 generations ago. So, and I can talk a lot about this. So, what time do I have right now? I have 20 minutes. Okay, great. Ongoing efforts to repeat past mistakes. Okay, so this is. I feel like this. I was kind of toying with what to call this, but I think there is a sustained effort to, or on behalf of some leaders, to encourage people to forget the support that their parents and grandparents received in the past, and to reinstitute some of these structural conditions that open up opportunities for some groups and close them for others. So we're seeing new forms of exclusion. And I think I'm just going to, one of them is there's a very high cost of higher education. This is a huge problem, not just for Mexican kids. It's for any family, right, who doesn't have a lot of money and the resources. And the fact that we make education up through 12th grade free, but not beyond. And so this creates a problem for all kinds of families. But then there's also this other thing. This is a newer problem. There's always been undocumented immigration, but increasingly we have not been updating our immigration laws such that now we have a growing class of people who don't have immigration status, even though their labor here is very, very much in demand. And so we have sort of an immigration system that's out of date with what our actual labor force needs are. And so that's why we end up having this really large pool of people here without legal rights. And now, of course, there's new efforts to restrict citizenship to children born of these immigrants. So I do a lot of work, like David said, I do a lot of work in this area, so I wanted to kind of talk a bit about it in some detail. So of all this number's wrong, it's more like 50 million people. Half of them are naturalized citizens today. Maybe 20% have a green card, but they're not yet a citizen. Some people are here on temporary visas, so those are like students, yeah. Now, okay, now I'm getting into what we call the undocumented category. And actually, about a third of them actually are here with permission initially from the government. And so they have some kind of protection. So they applied for asylum and they're still waiting for a decision from the court. They have some kind of temporary protected status because there was a hurricane in their country and they were initially allowed in, you know. They have DACA, which is that program for childhood arrivals. So there's a whole series of these. So that's a growing group of people among the undocumented who are not totally undocumented, you know. And then there's this people, about 20%, who have no protections at all. I guess, you know, one person asked me, they said, why don't you call them illegal immigrants? And I said, well, and I just tried to be as polite as possible. And I said, you know, actually it's just not an accurate term because many of them, what is that, about a third at least, were here legally in some form or another. And it just depends on who is president whether or not they're going to be deported, you know. And so I wouldn't call that illegal. So how do we do this? David asked me to present this. How do we make these estimates? It's a simple subtraction. So we find a data source that will tell us how many foreign-born people there are in the country. And then we use administrative data to subtract the number of legal immigrants. So it kind of goes like this. 2023, we counted about 47.8 million foreign-born. We know that 2.4 million are temporary. So that's like students, people on visas. 8 million they came before 1982. Why is that significant? All of those people qualified for amnesty under Ronald Reagan, right, in 1986. That leaves 37.4 million who could be unauthorized. Now, some of them have green cards, so we think that there's about 27.2 million of them have green cards and are still living in the country. So that leaves 11.1 million who are likely undocumented. And then we think that there's about a 20% undercount, so we add that on top. And why do we think it's 20%? It's because populations leave footprints in all kinds of statistical systems. Birth records, death records, school enrollment records, censuses from foreign countries. We see their absence in those data. We put that all together, we come up with about 20% undercount. So that's how we kind of know that. So we got, right now the current estimate is 13.7 million. So I can use this data to do all kinds of interesting stuff, okay? So like for example, this is a chart showing the share of undocumented arrivals when they first get here. How many of them are children? This is really important for understanding access to schooling, right? And when we talk about excluding kids from public schools. So right now, maybe a third of undocumented arrivals are children. I can also look at the data and find out like how long they're likely to live here in the United States as undocumented immigrants. And so here I've got along the bottom the percentage who arrived as children. And then along the top is the expected duration of stay in the country as an undocumented immigrant. Many of these countries, there's a lot of variation on childhood arrivals, but they don't stay so long because their parents find a way to legalize, or they go home after overstaying a visa for a short period or something like that. But we have one group of people from Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Venezuela, who are projected to live here for basically the rest of their adult lives as undocumented immigrants. So now we're talking about people who come here with no access to higher education, forming families, having children, entering the labor force, really living out their lives as stateless individuals. And they're mostly Latinos. Recently, I worked on this little project here where we're trying to figure out what ending birthright citizenship would do to the undocumented population. So this is a projection of the number of undocumented immigrants if the inflows and outflows just remain the same over time. Now, we would expect there to be sort of a steady decline right now if that happened. And the reason we think that is because undocumented immigrants are actually getting older, and so some of them are going to die, right? And so they're not being replenished as quickly as they're going to die in the future. But if we started saying, oh, if you have two undocumented parents, or if you have two parents without, like just on a temporary visa, and those children stay in the United States, this is what we're talking about in terms of the future. And those green people here are the US-born individuals without citizenship. And so, you know, and if you compare that to projections from the Census Bureau, what this means is 8.4% of children under the age of 20 would be stateless, essentially, in the country. And so this is kind of forming a new class or caste of individuals without full rights. So, I mean, we're kind of going back, right, in time. So I have a new project where we're trying to put out a lot of this information on the web, because we think that this is not cutting through, you know? And so I'm pairing up with Nicole Kreisberg. She's my colleague at Penn State. She's a qualitative sociologist. And what we're trying to do is put together the numbers with the people and try to kind of figure out a way to get those stories out there. What does this mean for individuals, for these children, and for the communities that they live in? And so Hannah is our web programmer, and so we're still trying to raise money to pay Hannah to help us with some of this work. So moving ahead, it's really hard to say, but I think immigration is going to continue, regardless of whether we want it or not. You know, just because all you guys are retiring, right? Who's going to fill those jobs? And so immigration is the only source of labor force growth, you know, going forward. And advocacy groups are working to try to make things fair, and I think what we need to do is be there to help them out and, you know, help them in their efforts. So I think I'll just stop there, and you guys can ask questions. Here's some resources.
Wait for the mic. There we go.
Thanks, Bob. Jennifer, thank you. Great presentation. The differences, the comparisons you had there with the Irish group, with the Mexican-American immigrants, that gap over time, over generations, narrows in the northern states, but remains pretty wide in the southern states. What was the role of labor unions during policies were being made at that time? You know, the labor union was a strong supporter and got child labor laws passed through because they wanted them out of the labor force.
Yes.
Okay, it wasn't, but the fact that so many Italians and other Western, Northern European groups were located in the Northwest, the labor unions were much stronger, and those schools were better paid because of the tax rolls in those neighborhoods. So what role explains that as a result of this gap that you saw in the southern states?
What do you mean?
The fact that labor unions weren't in the southern states, okay? They were
Yeah.
primarily in the northern states. So
I think there was a deliberate strategy, right, in the South to continue sort of the labor control practices that they had enjoyed under slavery. And so they really didn't like to see the end of that, right? Sure. And so a lot of the, like Texas was settled by people who wanted to continue the practice of slavery. Whereas California was settled by people from the Midwest who were not accustomed to that, and they were more progressive in their approach to labor, I think.
Before we go on, just a reminder,
Yeah.
Judy asked me to remind you all that this is being recorded.
The chart that showed the different groups and the time it took to reach the educational level, the normative level, is there any evidence that the Hispanic Americans are going to achieve in the fourth generation what other groups achieved in the third generation? In other words, that they started in a deeper hole and it just takes one more generation to get out of the hole?
I guess, you know, the optimistic person in me would hope for that. I did not include this in the talk because I was worried about time, but I have a positive story to tell about what happened in Texas in the 1990s. So there was a series of court cases in Texas that was levied against the state, saying you have to distribute school funding more equitably than you have been doing. And at first they were not successful, but eventually the Supreme Court weighed in and said, yes, you do have to redistribute the funds. And so this started under actually Ross Perot, and then Ann Richards, and then George W. Bush. And they were all into kind of changing the system so that the funds were distributed more fairly. George W. Bush, of course, became known for some of his other programs that was insisting on more equity in children's learning outcomes. And this became No Child Left Behind across the country. Now, whatever you think about testing, high-stakes testing and that sort of thing, it worked in the case of Latinos and Mexican American kids. And it leveled out a lot of their learning outcomes. And so when I look at today's new immigrants, at least up to the second generation, we're seeing outcomes that kind of look like Italians from the past, you know? So it looked good for a while there. What I'm less optimistic about is where we're headed right now, you know? And so it seems like there's a lot of forces out there that are trying to reinstitute some of these controls that would make it less likely for certain groups to get access to school and to higher education.
I assume it might be obvious, but do you have any data on what happens when people marry outside of their ethnic group or such?
All of my data here, there's an interesting story there because there is a lot of out marriage, right, and even among Mexican Americans. So by the time you get to about the third generation, maybe a third of them have one parent who's not Mexican and one parent who is, or something like that. So we do not rely on self-identification to put them in these categories. We include all of the kids, regardless of what they identify as long as they have at least one Mexican grandparent. So they're all in the sample. But the kids who are from those marriages end up doing better in school. And I think it's just selection into those kinds of.
When I looked at your initial data set, you had roughly years were now 40s, 70s, and on. And I wonder if the immigrant arrivals that you were talking about, the first generation, no, they were not rich, they couldn't whatever, but they could get drafted. And so the second generation was the result of the GI Bill, maybe?
Oh, that's a good point. I think there's a lot of research on that. And I think it was a huge thing that made it possible for a lot of them to go to college. But I did not do that research. Yeah.
I want to follow up on that, and that is, to what degree did that GI Bill create support for my generation in going to college and affordability? as I remember, I mean, I bet we all remember, I paid like $13 a credit hour,
Yeah.
right? And I'm wondering if that was a reflection, that all that support for inexpensive college.
I'm sure it helped, yeah.
This may be a question outside your wheelhouse and more appropriate for an economist, but I'm wondering about the new tariff policy and its potential implications for immigration. So our clothing is produced out of country, mostly in places like Lesotho, Pakistan, and so forth. If the intent is to place a higher price on that and thus to have more garment manufactured in the United States, that would require a labor pool, which I take it does not exist. And so that would place more incentive for immigration.
So I think Elon Musk thinks that it's all going to become mechanized and AI'd, right? Yeah. So I think that's what they think is going to happen. I don't know. Yeah.
There was a recent proposal, and I don't know if it's reached the bill stage, to legalize, to lower the age of work to allow children to work again.
I know.
Is there I hope there's a huge pushback against that, but do you know anything about that?
A lot of those initiatives, like there's one in Oklahoma, I think there was one in Florida, I don't know. A lot of those places are where there's already a large migrant labor pool, and a lot of that is in agriculture. And so I think many of the kids that they have in mind for working in these jobs are probably immigrant kids. Yeah.
It seems there's a correlation between point of entry
Where is it?
as an immigrant, and your one chart sort of indicated that if you were in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, in other words, if you came through Ellis Island, your chance of success is far greater than
Right.
if you came in through, let's say, New Orleans. And so is it more about where people land than?
Well, I think some of it is. If you were recruited to work on a plantation in Texas, probably that was a combination because they targeted Mexicans because they thought they were the appropriate kind of laborer that they could control. That said, though, it is partly because of where you landed. So we looked in the data and we found families, Mexican families, who started in Texas. But they, maybe they have older children and they have younger children. And we were able to see, okay, if the kids did most of their schooling in Texas, they didn't go very far. And then some of those families moved to places like Chicago or Flint or somewhere in the Midwest. And there were a lot of those kinds of families too. And they had younger children. And their younger children went much farther in school than their older siblings did. Conversely, if they moved back to Texas, it was the reverse. So even within the same family, the siblings that had access to Midwestern schools did much better than the siblings who were stuck in Texas schools. Yeah.
What about migrant children? I mean, there are a lot of agricultural workers here that spend the winter in Texas and the summer here.
Oh, the migrant children who work here. There's a whole group of people interested in this topic. I don't study this directly, so I know that there's programs for those kids, but it's hard for them because they're moving around a lot. Yeah.
I can tell you that as a teacher at West Otto, we had a large migrant agricultural population. And those kids would come in the September, and they'd be with us through mid-October. They'd begin disappearing. And we would work with them more or less successfully. But then they would go back to wherever, Texas, a lot of them, and as their parents worked the seasons. And when they would come back to us in, March, April, March, they'd come from Texas with grades like B+, A-, and we would assess how much they had progressed, and the grades did not match the progress on the grade.
David?
I have a fascination with how you count the unauthorized immigrant population, especially
Go back.
Among people who don't want to be counted. And do I understand from what you said, and if I recall our prior conversations correctly too, that it is easy to count the number of people who are born and who die? And you can generalize from those two statistics something about the larger population?
Yes. So our vital statistics system is pretty good, okay? So if you die in the United States, it is going to be recorded, okay? And then the death certificate records where you were born. And so we use that to look at the number of deaths to the foreign-born. And we can extrapolate as a demographer, right? We have these special methods. We can extrapolate how large is the population that would produce, I say in quotes, that many deaths. And so we can extrapolate out. So we know the undocumented population is not 30 million. Because otherwise they would be a population that would live a life expectancy of maybe 85 years, which would be higher than any population on Earth. So, does that make sense?
Okay. Whew, I thought Gordon was coming in to tell me I needed to wrap up. But I do. So I thank Jenny very much. Jenny, did you bring a couple books? Okay, Jenny has a book. She has, the link there for purchasing books, but we had a couple people I know who had asked me last week if Jenny was going to bring books. So at least one for you. Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. This is fascinating. I'm really glad you could come. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I know your mom is very happy, too. Thank you. Just since it's not in the bulletin, just a little bit of information about the rest of April. Next week, on April 13, the Hope Church Carbon Footprint Team is going to report as we work to eliminating our own carbon footprint here at Hope Church. They're going to talk about that. So that will be next week. And then, of course, on Easter, on the 20th, there is no adult ed. We'll be doing our Easter brunch as usual. So no adult ed then. But then the following week, Creation Care will follow up with a session from Eighth Day Farm. And Andy Rosendahl from Eighth Day Farm will be here to talk about urban farming and other such things. On that same day, as you'll recall, we had the Humanity for Prisoners presentation, and he offered to come back with a film. And he's going to do that on the last Sunday of April there, April 27th, because that's Pizza Sunday. So the film will be shown during Pizza Sunday. You can have time to come and grab your pizza and salad and various things and take it into the chapel. And Andy, his first name, and it escapes me, but he will show the film in the chapel on that day as well. And yes, adult education team members, we are having a meeting on Wednesday. I see it's not in the bulletin, but those of you who are on the adult ed team, yes, we are meeting Wednesday, so please make sure that's on your calendar. Thank you all very much. Thank you.